Hi, it's Kreampuff and welcome to my channel. I was recently working on this hexagon centerpiece for a dining room table when a moment of inspiration struck. Here's the moment. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, that looked like the beginning of a head. So I designed a series of Halloween ghouls off of that photo. Today we're going to start with Frankenstein. So grab your best green material and let's get started. Alright, it is time to get working on Frankenstein. So the first thing that we need to do is cut out a hexagon. And I'm going to do this on the back of it so that I can use a regular pen so you guys can see it. So I'm going to lay, this is Missouri Star Quilt's half hexagon for 10-inch squares. I'm going to lay that on here. And I'm just going to trace around 3 sides, making sure to make my corner points very dark so that I can see them, because we'll use those when we draw the other side. Okay, so now I'm going to flip the ruler around, and this is notched for seam allowances. So if I go like this, I'd end up with a little notch there. What I want to do is move the upper edge to match the upper edge on what would have been the other side. So that looks good. I'm going to just take a ruler and place it up against that and make sure that this is good on that side, and it does look pretty good. And I'm going to draw 3 sides again. Alright, there is our hexagon. Now you could lay the half hexie back onto the material and cut it out there, but I find it easier just to line up one edge instead of 3. So there is the beginning of Frank. The next thing that we need to do is to add his chin. Now on this one, I did add a 2-inch strip. So I'm going to cut just a little bit. Just square this off. I'm just going to cut a 2-inch strip. Now remember, it doesn't need to be as wide as this because you're going to actually trim it. You're going to follow these lines and trim it down a little bit. So if it's a little bit short on the bottom, you're fine, but this should be about 5 inches. So I need a 2-inch square or a 2-inch by 5-inch rectangle. So there's that. Now I'm just going to sew on the chin. So let me do that and I will be right back. Alright, Frank has a chin. Now I'm just going to line up a ruler and follow the line of the hexagon and trim that up. Okay, so that is a great start. Okay, we have Frank's face squared up. Now it is time to make his hairline. Now if you want to skip this step, feel free, just leave this as green and then just put a black around it, but I think it does add a little bit more character. I'm not going to put a face on here. If you want to put a face, you can just applique your face right on here, and that might make him a little bit more distinguishable, but I think this jagged hairline is distinguishable enough to be Frankenstein. But it's your piece, do what you'd like. So in order to get that, we need to make some half square triangles. These are the littlest half square triangles. This is a 1.5 inch square that we will be using for half square triangles. So draw a line, and I do recommend drawing a line. We don't have a lot of room for air on a piece this size. So draw your line, stack it up with a black, and sew 1/4 inch, and it should be a scant 1/4 inch just to make sure that you have enough room. So 1/4 inch on this side and 1/4 inch on this side. Slice it down the middle, and you'll have 2 squares. Iron them open. Oh, let me touch this one up quick. Okay. All right, now to square this up, we're squaring this up to 1 inch. So, I know this is really tiny and it might be difficult to see. Let me zoom in for you guys. All right, so I have about 1/8 inch extra. So what I want to do is to make sure that my stripes are going across, and then I have a little bit of material on this side of 1 inch. So that to me looks pretty good. And trim it up. Flip it around, and now is when we line up exactly on the 1 inch mark. So one there. Oops, that's moved just a smidge. Should be okay. And there. So there is our 1 inch half square triangle. You can do it. Just take your time. Make sure to get a good press on this because we are going to have a lot of bulk in a small area. So let me finish the rest of mine up and I'll be right back. Alright, I hope you got those sewn perfectly. Now mine are squared up to 1 inch, just like we talked about. And here's the layout. We're going to make use 2 half square triangles to make a point with the black. So now we're just going to sew these together and then sew them into a strip. So you should end up with 4 points of hair that we're going to sew into here. So let me sew those together and I'll be right back. Alright, I hope everybody got that sewn together correctly. I did trim mine up. It is tough when you're trying to fit only 1 inch underneath your foot. It can end up a little bit wonky, so just trim it up to 1 inch. So we are going to have to cut just a smidge off of here. So this piece will be 3/4 inch. This piece will lose 1/4 inch on the seam allowance. So 3/4 minus the 1/4 inch seam allowance means we have to cut off 1/2 inch on this piece. So let's cut that off of this piece. Okay. Again, it's okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to sew this piece on here. Alright, so I have that sewn on now. And now I'm just going to lay a ruler here and line it up and then cut this so that we have the same shape on the sides. Okay, so there we have Frank's hairline all in place. It only actually took a couple minutes to put that in. And get this little piece out of there. There we go. Okay, so now let's add the hair. So I have some, this is from a leftover honey bun. And I'm just going to sew down one side. So what I'm going to do, and just make sure of your edges on this, is I'm going to sew the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to cut here, and I'm going to cut here. So just make sure that you have enough overlap here so that when you make the cut you're not short. I'm going to sew another piece on the opposite side, same thing. We're going to cut across the top and following this line up so that we don't have any shortages on the edges. So let me do that and I'll be back. Okay, I have the 2 edges on. Now I'm just going to line up my ruler, cut off this excess. I'm going to do the 2 edges first and then do the top in one cut so it gives me a cleaner line. So cut that off. Alright, to cut the top, we're just going to make sure we're all good all the way around. So this should be 3/4 of an inch. 3/4 of an inch. Cut this off. Alright, Frank's got almost a mohawk. So now I'm going to take another piece and sew it onto the top of his head. So again, remember, watch your seams to make sure that you have enough room so that when you flip it up, you're covered all the way across. Alright, now for you that was just a few seconds thanks to some editing, but for me that was about 5 minutes because a couple years ago I'm trying to create better habits when sewing, and so every time I have to rewind my bobbin I take that little brush that came with my machine and brush out the bobbin case and where the thread is, and just to keep it all nice and clean because I don't want my machine in the shop for a week. So I found that if I do that every time I change my bobbin I don't have as many issues. So now we're going to trim this up. Just make a cut there and line it up in quarters, 1/4. Alright, Frank is done. Let me just trim these off here. I can find my line, 1 1/4, 1 1/4. Frank a quick haircut. Alright, so Frank is done, and now all we need to do is to add in our corners. So let me grab the material for that. Alright, so I haven't sewed anything down, I just laid Frank on top of my piece. And there is a way mathematically to go ahead and do all of the math, but I'm just going to cheat a little bit. So I've laid it on there, and I want a little bit more. Normally you just leave a little bit extra here so you'd have your 1/4 inch seam allowance. I want a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is I have the first half of his head lined up in the corner where I want it. I'm going to slide it down about 1/4 inch. I'm going to cut a piece out to coordinate with his head. That'll give me the angle that I need to sew on. So there is one side of his head. And that was about, what? About 1.5 inches. So I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm just going to mark it real quick. So I want to take this piece and cut out about 1.5 inches. There we go. And now do the same thing cutting this angle out. Ooh, oops. Let me go back here. Let's try this again. Ooh, that was not good, but oh well, it'll still work. It'll give me the right angle that I can square up his head. Alright, so I'm going to sew this side to his head, and I am going to put a piece across the top, so I'm going to move this down a little bit. It'll give me a little bit bigger of a piece. But since we're going to square the piece off at the top of his head, I'm going to move it down. I already have the angle in. So I'm just going to go and sew these on with 1/4 of an inch in seam allowance. Alright, so here is Frank sewed up. Looks like he has some earmuffs. So what I'm going to do is take my ruler and cut along the line. Right. I can get it lined up. There's one side. And the other. I'll do the same thing. Let's see. Do half. Where's this down? All right. Kind of looks like Dracula there, but oh well. Okay, so now we need to do the longer pieces. Now because my material is directional, it's gonna be a little bit of a waste. If you just kind of used an all over pattern, you could just line this up anywhere you wanted on the material. But since I want everything flying in the same direction, there is going to be a bit of waste. So I need, let's lay this out flat. Okay, now I have this lined up the way I wanted. Now this is where my original cuts were, so I just slid it down to get my bats going in the same direction. So, slide this up a little bit. Now I am going to square it off here on his chin and put a strip across this way. So I really only need to come down to that point, but I do want a little bit more up there so that I have about 1/4 of an inch for seam allowance. So all right, there's one, all free there. And give myself a little bit on this side. Oops, sorry. All right, so now this piece will get sewn to this side. I need to do the same for the other side. Now for this one, I can actually use part of his head that we used the first time. So again, we're trying to square this up. So I'm going to come out a little bit. And this method isn't perfect. If you have a different way you want to try, please feel free. This is just because I have I want my bats to all be flying in the same direction. And again, we always trim everything to square it up. So I am not worried at all about if everything is perfect. So just do a quick look up. Alright, so he should be fine that way. I'm actually kind of long on this one, but that's okay. Alright, so I'm going to sew these 2 seams on and I'll be back. Alright, I have sewn the 2 side pieces on. Now I'm going to trim up the bottom Remember this seam, this chin piece that we put on was 2 inches, so we lost 1/4 of an inch, so it should be 175, and that is where I'm going to trim it up to. Now I'm a little short over here. I'll trim it up when I get on the next step. So again, I'm not worried about that at all. Okay. So now I'm ready to trim up the sides. Here is my point, and remember, no matter what you do, if you want it real tight to the head, trim it at 1/4 of an inch, and then you should not hit the hairline. But I'm going to do it an inch past the line, or I'm sorry, the edge of the hairline, so that I can have enough, I'm not encroaching on that hairline too much. Alright, so I am 1 inch, right there's the hairline. I'm just going to square this up. There's one side. Flip it over. Now I got a lot on this side. It's okay. Alright, so my straight edge is here. Again, 1 inch past the hairline. Alright, 1 inch is there. Straighten up my bottom line. Alright. Again, this isn't waste. I will find another way to use that, even if it ends up in my scrap bin cut into blocks. Okay, so now I'm just going to cut probably a 2-inch strip of the batt material, sew it to the top, sew it to the bottom, and square it up. Let me take care of that and I'll be back. Alright, here is the block. I sewed on the borders on the top. I think that finishes his hair off nicely. That way when I put this into a table runner or do a centerpiece, his hair doesn't get lost in the other background. I think it's just a nice way to frame it off. Now when I did do that, I actually just took a scissors and cut off my strips, and then I starched the crap out of it. I know normally you don't do that with a finished block, but for me, these kind of specialty blocks, especially the hexagon block, I need to make sure everything is perfectly flat. So I starch it, I let it sit for 2 to 3 minutes, and then I go in and iron it and square everything up. Now this block squared up to 12.5 by 13 3/4. So it is ready to be put into a table runner with my other ghouls. If I need to make it a different size, I do have a little bit of leeway here and here that I can either trim down, or I can just add another round of sashing all the way around to square it up. Alright, here is Frankenstein. He is awaiting his friends on the table runner of ghouls. Up next, the mummy. If you liked this video, please press and steam the subscribe button. This is Kreampuff. I'll see you soon.